Hello everyone, and welcome to this special conversation. I'm Iris, one of the R&D scientists at 9N Technologies.
And I'm Veronica, also part of the R&D team here at 9N. We work on developing graphene-based electronics, and today we're doing something a little bit different.
Indeed, today we're doing something a bit different, and we're really excited to be talking with someone who has been shaping the graphene landscape from the ground up. This is Mr. James Baker. He's the CEO of Graphene at Manchester and the Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre. Yeah.
James, thank you so much for joining us. We're genuinely looking forward to just having a relaxed chat about graphene, scaling up, and what makes projects actually work.
So before we start with our conversation, I would really appreciate if you could give us a bit of your background for anyone who's not familiar with you or your work.
Thanks very much and delighted to be here this afternoon. So I'm James Baker, the Chief Executive of Graphene at Manchester. So part of the University of Manchester, looking at the commercialisation of not just graphene, but a whole family of two-dimensional materials. But my background is not an academic, it's from industry. I worked for over 25 years in aerospace and defence, very much in the technology area, but really about taking new technologies and accelerating them through to commercialization.
Oh, that's amazing. So you've really built that bridge. It's one of the reasons we're so excited to talk with you today.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's quite important. And it's not just about the science, it's about how you accelerate that science and the materials into new products and applications is the exciting part for me.
indeed, that sounds very exciting. So starting from the beginning, what actually inspired you in creating these companies, and what was the gap that you were trying to fill?
Sure, yeah. So I'm sure many of your listeners know that graphene was first isolated up in Manchester in 2004, taking the sticky tape and the graphite to isolate a single atomic layer of carbon graphene. 2010, they then received the Nobel Prize for Physics, not just for that discovery, but for the properties of this new two-dimensional material. It was around that time, though, that Manchester got into some dialogue around how do we, as well as doing the great science, the UK's got a great reputation for discovery, but how, as well as the science, do we also achieve made in Britain? And that really led into two things. First of all, it was the National Graphene Institute up in Manchester, which is very much around the science. And then shortly afterwards came the Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre, the GEIC, which was really about the translation of that science working with industry. So part of the university, but bridging that gap between academia and industry was really the inspiration around the GEIC and how we work with industry to create new supply chain.
Yeah, that is brilliant. That is really sounds really exciting. So it's a little bit like a launchpad, but grounded in industry, right?
So it's grounded in academia, but very much industrially driven. So our buzzword is the geek is industry led, but academic fed. We really want to bring the goodness of that science and engineering that takes place in UK universities, but also create new supply chain companies making material, but also companies who use that material in products and applications. And that's, I think, the real challenge of the geek. Less to do with graphene, more about how do we work with existing companies and new companies to start to make a difference that these new 2D materials can have in our lifestyle.
Okay, that's great. And since Geek and Graphene were launched, how have things changed? Or for instance, what does graphene landscape look like now compared to, let's say, before you started these companies?
So I always start this conversation by saying graphene is 20 years young, not 20 years old, but 20 years young. And that's really recognizing that it does take traditionally many years for a new material from discovery through to products in the marketplace. And I think when I joined just over 10 years ago, just before the geek, industry was starting to engage in graphene, but you couldn't really make it more than a gram. It was still quite unsure around what graphene was or what graphene wasn't. Was there a standard? Was there a regulation that said something was graphene and something wasn't graphene? So 10 years ago, it was still very early. And I often talk about the three waves of industrial engagement. 10 years ago, the first wave is when industry first started to look. And it was generally the pioneers, the people who were prepared to take a risk, the new companies like yours who saw this graphene and thought, how do I create value from this? The second wave in my language was around 5 years ago when people started to engage a little bit more seriously, but there were still challenges around producing quality graphene, whether it was top down, bottom up, flakes of graphene or sheets of graphene. So still a little bit of learning was taking place. And some companies did very well, and you started to see a few products on the marketplace. But many companies failed or didn't get a very good result from using the graphene because they used it incorrectly or because they didn't really understand the detail of how to formulate or coat or mix. And now I look to today, I use a term, the third wave, where we're now getting much better engagement, the big companies, the small companies, but a lot of the change is being driven by the small companies. The big companies who got disillusioned 5 years ago are now finding these new startups and new businesses. In the last 10 years alone in Manchester, we've had 65 new businesses involving graphene and 2D materials, and they're now starting to scale. They're getting investment, they're creating products. So, yeah, very different landscape today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And for me, it's very exciting to see the growth of companies not making graphene, but companies who use that graphene or 2D materials to make a difference in their products or application.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So the entire landscape of the graphene industry really has matured over the past few years, hasn't it?
Definitely matured, and it's still not mature. It's still quite
Mhm.
early, 20 years young. But I think you're now starting to see both graphene suppliers making graphene by the gram, by the kilo, by the ton, or by the meter squared. But you're also seeing companies who are using that to build everything from houses to concrete to batteries to space. I think one of our partners has got two satellites as we yeah, I often joke about graphene all around us. There are two satellites orbiting Earth at the moment with graphene coatings on those satellite payloads. Only small, only prototypes, but already you're starting to see graphene starting to mature into many sectors.
Wow. As you mentioned, I'm sure that you have completed countless projects in your company. And now you mentioned the one regarding space and how can you include graphene in these technologies. Are there other projects that you are particularly proud of and where you think that this is why you built GEIC and graphene?
So one of the great things around working with graphene is we're working on so many different sectors and so many different areas, from space to growing food to creating clean drinking water. So lots of really exciting things that, my motto has always been about making a difference. And in the world we live in today, and climate change is all around us. You know, probably the warmest May and April we've had for many years. I live in Manchester in North Wales, and I don't think it's rained for 2 weeks. So really seeing some impact of climate change. And I think graphene can really play a role from more sustainable concrete for construction through to creating clean drinking water, through to lightweighting of structures that use less energy, less pollution, less emissions. So lots of things that I'm proud of. I think the thing I'm most proud of really is really the ecosystem of new companies that are starting to really grow. Quite proud to see these companies that maybe 3, 4 years ago was an academic or a researcher like yourselves who were in universities who had ideas. And I now see those companies starting to grow. They're starting to employ people. They're starting to get products in the marketplace. And one of our partners in particular is on track to become one of the first graphene unicorns. That's $1 billion business. 4 years ago, it was a researcher. And within 4 years, we're really starting to see that acceleration of these companies get investment, getting scale, and starting to make an impact on a global basis. So yeah, lots of things to be proud of, but I think, a number of companies, a number of technologies that clearly make you very excited and make you smile when you come into work every day, which is always a great thing.
Well, that's so cool and very impactful as well.
Yeah, it's something that I really enjoy. I joke about it, but one of the companies in the geek are making tomatoes and lettuces. Another one's got graphene in space. Another one's doing concrete. Another one's making the next generation of batteries. And it's not just graphene. We have companies who are working on MXenes, Maxenes, companies using boron nitride, molybdenum disulfide. So it's not just graphene, it's this whole family of two-dimensional materials that we're really starting to see make an impact in products and applications that really excites me.
So I guess going from lab research to manufacturing, it must be very hard. Usually, what mistakes do you see companies making over and over again while trying to do that?
Yeah, I think that's really the purpose of the geek in that why does it take many years from the lab into the marketplace is that, several things. First of all, typically you need in a deep tech business like materials, you need a lot of access to capital. And that can be expensive and it can be quite painful if you buy the wrong piece of kit and it doesn't work. So part of what the geek does is provide that space, that capital equipment to enable companies to experiment fast and to learn and to move very quickly. So I think what often happens traditionally is people spend what I call an innovation cycle that is measured in months and years. And if it takes you a year cycle to make something and then fail and then do it again, it can take many years and lots of investment and capital and time, to actually take your product to market. So a lot of companies I see, to try to do it on their own in their own facility, if you get that right, great, because you can control it, you can do things without anybody interfering, if you like. But I'm very much a supporter of what I'd call open innovation. So open innovation is where you bring the best of the supply chain, the equipment. You still do it very confidentially. It's not about sharing all your secrets. But if you can do that in an environment like the Geek, you can learn, you can do things a lot quicker. So we have an innovation cycle that we measure in days and weeks rather than months and years. And we have a philosophy about failing fast. So if you can fail fast and learn and move on, then you can get to your end goal much quicker, much cheaper. And I think that's probably the key learning is how do we really do that very rapid innovation and engineering and I think your business as well, electronics. In the early days, people failed quite and spent lots of money on making CVD graphene. Whereas I'm seeing some real progress now in electronics because people have learned, they've now got new methodologies of working. And I think there's a real opportunity to bring, for example, electronics to market a lot quicker than we would traditionally.
Amazing. I wanted to ask, is it tempting for a lot of early companies to maybe overcomplicate things by adding lots of features instead of nailing one thing really well?
Yeah, I think sometimes I'm a strong believer, and I use this term ecosystem, that many of our spin outs are very, very clever people from universities. But what I'm starting to see is some real learning that if you can bring the right people alongside, maybe have someone who's from manufacturing or from engineering, and work together as a team, you can maybe overcome some of those. And I think it's a challenge in materials and deep tech. If you keep trying to improve and improve and improve, and it takes longer and longer before you get any sales, investors get quite impatient. So I'm also seeing some really interesting examples of what I would call bootstrapping, where what companies do maybe get a version one to the market fairly quick, maybe get some revenue and get some sales, but then they continue doing that innovation to come up with a generation two, a generation three, a generation four. So it doesn't mean you stop innovating, but you really focus about, getting that spiral innovation. So a good example is concrete. Um, you could continually trying to evolve concrete mixes, for high-rise buildings, for bridges, and you could be innovating for the next 10, 20 years. Or you can get version one, which is a precast slab for a sleeper on a railway or a pathway, and get that to market fairly quickly, get some sales, and then develop it into a Gen 2, into a Gen 3. So I think we're seeing some quite interesting models now where if you can get revenue, you're more attractive to an investor. So yeah, getting product to market that's maybe fairly simple, but then continue innovating for a next generation is a better model than continually trying to strive for everything in your first iteration because you might never get there. But again, it depends very much on the sector is probably the other factor. Yeah, you wouldn't go straight to an aircraft wing because it's quite difficult, it's quite complex. But maybe for a seat in an aircraft or an unmanned vehicle, the quicker ways of getting into the aerospace market is another good example.
That is a great insight. I guess you don't have to be perfect from the start when you're working in a startup company. But something that made me curious about from what you said. So I guess it must be hard for that many people from with different backgrounds, from different disciplines to collaborate. How do you make people from academia and people from industry to actually work together?
It's a very good question, and I react a little bit. It's very difficult to make an academic do anything, is my experience. You know, Manchester, as an example, has a principle of academic freedom, which I learned very quickly meant that you can't really make an academic do anything that he doesn't want to do. And as I mentioned earlier, we have some great academics across the UK, and generally academics are rewarded by papers, by publications, by citations. You know, so the normal way of rewarding or sort of accelerating a career in academia is not through commercialization. So it's difficult to make it, but if you can make a situation where an academic can see value from the commercialization, it makes his research more impactful, or it enables them to get a greater credit in terms of research, then for me it becomes more acceptable or more palatable. But everybody is different is probably the other thing is I'm a strong believer if you want to be an academic and that's what really drives you, you know, that's what we should enable to happen. But maybe bring other people, maybe it's the postdoctoral researchers, or maybe it's the students, or maybe it's someone from outside who can then take that concept and idea and work together. So, you know, the Geek is very much like a platform that tries to facilitate that. The NGI, National Graphene Institute, is really for the academics who want to do academic work. The Geek is more for the ones who may want to do industrial work. And there's no right answer. Some like to do the research, some quite happy doing commercial, other are happy to do commercial as long as they can keep doing their day job, if you like, of research and academia. So there's no single size, one size fits all. But you know what we're trying to create with graphene, and I think it's a model we can use across other areas, is really doing academia and doing commercialization. You don't have to do both, but if you want to do commercialization, there's a platform for do it. If you want to do research and teaching, again, that's good. And how do we bridge that between that? And that's really what we're trying to achieve from and what we call graphene at Manchester. It's good to do research, it's good to do commercialization, but you've got a choice to do all of those. And that's what we're really trying to achieve with graphene and advanced materials.
Yeah, so sometimes when we have such a diverse team with so many people from different backgrounds, does it kind of take a lot of trust, and it's like breaking the translator barrier as you have people move from to between different worlds.
Yeah, trust is a very good word, you know, and you know, a good example sort of touched on earlier is intellectual property. You know,
Mhm.
if you don't trust people and you go behind closed doors, you don't take advice, you know, that can be a good solution because you're very secret, but it means you miss the opportunity to seek external inputs. So we operate in an environment of trust. You know, we want people to talk, but we also absolutely respect confidentiality. So I think having something like the Geek is great because we have areas that are closed, you know, meeting rooms or labs that you can't wander through. There's not people just wandering around the building. So there's a lot of not security, a lot of sensitivity that confidentiality is key. But then there are other areas like the kitchen and sofas where people can sit and they can build those relationships and have conversations. So for me, having a facility like the Geek is good to enable that conversation and to build those relationships and trust. But not everybody trusts everyone. So, you can't expect everyone to like everybody. You've got to build those communities, build those networks, and some people embrace those. Some people are still very secretive. So I think it's about diversity, and I think that's one of the strengths of advanced materials. I use the term I'm male, pale, and stale. So for me, it's great talking to students who are coming through from all sort of backgrounds, diversity, and sustainability also seems to get people engaged in materials because making clean drinking water through to energy, through to electronics, it really is a broad area that can bring people from many different backgrounds, which I find very exciting.
Wow. Thank you for explaining that. That was actually very interesting. And it feels like you're bridging old sectors. You're basically making people socialize together and create new ideas. But I'm curious about something different. So the word sustainability has been trending for some time now in manufacturing and in industry. And we know that sustainability is becoming central to materials research and development. How is it influencing what you're doing there at Geek?
So it's a very big influence. It probably was less so when we first started. I think the sensitivity is that for me, what really drives industry is productivity. They want something that's lower cost, something that's cheaper, something that's higher performance that they can sell and can make money. So most industry is driven really not by sustainability, by productivity. However, over the last years, particularly with climate change, sustainability has been coming up the agenda because people see what's happening around the world in terms of climate. And not everybody, but a large majority of people want to do something that addresses that climate change and that impact. I think where I'm seeing a real opportunity, though, is I think you can have something that's more sustainable without the compromise in terms of performance and cost that traditionally is seen with sustainability. What I mean by that is, often when you say you want to do something sustainable, it costs you more, or you have something that isn't as good, or doesn't last as long, or is a little bit of a compromise, but makes you feel good because it's more sustainable, but costs you a little bit more. I think the opportunity we have with advanced materials like graphene is you can start to use more sustainable solutions. You can start to recycle, is probably one of the best ones. First of all, graphene itself, you can get, for example, from methane. Methane is a waste, CH4. We can convert that plasma reactor to hydrogen and to carbon. Use the hydrogen for fuel, use the carbon as graphene as an additive. So this circular economy means that you can now start to use your waste and you can reuse it. Again, we have several partners in the Geek. One's actually building houses out of waste material. Normally, waste material, you would say, oh, that's very poor quality, it'll fall down, it'll catch fire. But again, properties of graphene mean you can have waste that you can reuse. It's got structural integrity, so it's strong. It's also got flame retardancy, doesn't catch fire easily. Also, it's got very good insulation properties. So suddenly you're taking something that traditionally is waste into something that's valuable, so more sustainable, but it's also something that is commercially viable because you can build it for a lower cost than using new materials. So I think graphene 2D materials start to make sustainability a more viable option rather than a sort of a tick box and a nice to have. We're making batteries in the Geek, and one of our partners is doing something called a membrane-free redox flow battery. So this will be a battery not in your car, but in your house. People who live in Spain 2 weeks ago, who lost their power for 24 hours. If we had more of these batteries in your house, in your village, in your factory, and you were storing the energy for when you needed it. If there was a power cut or there was a reduction in or spike in energy, you could have that battery and that energy source to keep your cities lit up for 12, 24 hours. So some really exciting technologies that start to make sustainability a better option. And again, the challenge is how do we accelerate them? How do we bring them? And how do we actually get industry to adopt maybe some of these different ways of operating? Not to do with the material, it's the whole innovation. And again, another exciting thing for me just to touch on is the whole AI, artificial intelligence. It's not just about AI markets and new apps and new methodologies. It's also about designing our materials quicker, giving you the tools to do things in a much more rapid way.
So if you had to bet, what industries are going to be adopting graphene on a larger scale within the next few years?
I think what we're seeing most recently is fairly simple applications of graphene being adopted in this current wave. So lightweighting of structures, shoes, plastic bags, bottles, coatings. So where graphene has been more of an additive, so it's generally platelets that have been added to things to improve. I think what we're going to see over the next few years are some of the more disruptive areas where graphene or the properties of graphene play a key role. So that's everything from sensors and electronics. I think you're going to see quite a lot of progress there. And it's not replacing silicon, but it's probably going to be around some fairly specific sensors or some particular devices of electronic devices. Energy storage, I think, is another area. I think as well as complementing existing battery technologies, I'm seeing some new next generation battery technologies. That's everything from conventional batteries through to redox flow batteries through to supercapacitors. I think you'll start to see some changes in that area. The one that also really surprises me, and this has shown how much progress is being made, is graphene in biomedical applications. In Manchester last year, I think there were 5 patients who were treated with a graphene sensor on the brain, a company called InBrain. You're looking about using graphene in surgery. So this is to treat everything from brain disease through to, not treat, but to identify tumors in the brain through to ultimately potentially some sort of treatments. So yeah, it really is going to start seeing some new areas where the unique properties of graphene and 2D materials start to play a role rather than graphene as an additive that sort of improves the performance of something. But yeah, difficult to predict each one. Every market is slightly different, but already we're seeing some quite exciting technologies starting to scale and come to the market as we talk.
That is so interesting, especially what you said about applications in healthcare. I didn't know that. And the fact that graphene can actually potentially change people's lives by bringing good changes to
Yeah.
healthcare and improving it.
And that's for me a really big thing, although regulation, approval mean it won't happen overnight. But the fact that there've been operations with graphene in the body, you also answer some of the not concerns, but questions over toxicology. Careful with your language. There's many different forms of graphene, but if graphene is being used in healthcare, then certainly there's some real opportunities in many other sectors as well.
Mhm. So I guess you're working with a lot of different startups at GEIC. And what do you look for in a company, in a startup? And how do you decide who you're going to support?
Um, we're part of a university, so we're not sort of in a position where we can choose good ones or bad ones. Being blunt, if you've got a very good idea. Having said that, what I'm very keen in what I call a process called triage. So a bit like when you go to the hospital before you see a doctor, you go through a little bit of a process of someone assessing your business, your idea. And again, it's all under confidentiality, so we're not pinching secrets or taking anything, in terms of detail. But for me, no is sometimes a good answer rather than yes, we'll work with you. So I'm quite proud that for a few startups, a few ideas, we haven't said no, but we've sort of sent them back to think back and do a little bit more work rather than spend money trying to commercialize when the company's not ready. So we don't really pick winners sort of thing, but we create platforms that enable, the good companies to have the support, the infrastructure, the access to capital, the access to know-how that can help them on their journey. GEIC doesn't do everything. Companies still need money, unfortunately. As well as working with the GEIC, these companies either have to win a grant or win investment or have an industry sponsor. So I'm not alone in, if you like, in picking the successful ones. We can play a role in that, but we also need to bring together investors. We need to bring together the teams that we talked about. So again, I think what GEIC does a little bit is it creates that environment and the learning. One thing I'm quite proud of is some of the companies I talked about 3, 4 years ago who were academics or were part of my team, and now the CEO or CTO of a new business. They also quite proud of talking to the new startups to give them help and advice. And it's great if you go into a building and you can speak to 3 or 4 people who are same stage that you were at 3, 4 years ago, and they can just give you a little bit of advice and help. Again, I think that's a great benefit for a company, as opposed to someone who can't speak to anyone. No one, investment. I was talking to a startup the other day, and we talked about investment a little bit like dating. You may have to go through many, many dates before you find the right person or the right investor. And that can be very frustrating. It can be quite negative. But when you hear people who have been through that journey, who can help you, can give you a little bit of advice, then I think that really helps you learn and do things in a slightly different way. So again, we're not perfect. We're still learning. We're still a learning organization. But I think what you see in organizations like the GEIC, but it's not unique as an organization, it's that platform that enables people to learn quickly and to meet the right people is something that we're trying to achieve, not just on graphene, but on the whole engineering and innovation around advanced materials is something that we can hopefully build on.
So, for example, some of those companies that you had to say no to in the past, do they possibly get a second chance?
So there's some really good examples of companies that didn't sort of get funding or didn't get engagement in the first round, but had very good resilience. And for me, that's something again, I think that's a very good sign is that if you get rejected, some people might think, oh, that's it now, I'm going to do something else. And some do, something, that's not for me. But many of them go back, they listen and they take in those lessons and they come back a month later, 6 months later, a year later. Manchester has a competition called the Eli Harari Graphene Prize. So this is an annual competition for students, has a £50,000 first prize and a £20,000 second prize. So it's not big money, but £50,000 gets you a little bit of funding to kick your business off and your idea. And there are a number of examples there of companies who have entered in a year and not been successful, but have taken the feedback and come back the following year and they've won. So, yeah, I think we've seen many cases. But at the end of the day, if the idea is not very good and it's not distinctive or it's not something that's viable, I think it's better to stop. And I use this term fail fast. I'd rather fail fast and learn rather than bob along for 12, 18 months, 2 years, and then fail. So what we want to really improve is the success rate. Not every business will be successful. So it's not about only going for the ones that you're certain are going to be right. There is risk. But again, I think if you can take that learning and you can build on that, I think people do come back and they come back a lot better and a lot stronger, having taken that feedback and information. But not every business survives. And it's probably right that they don't, because if everyone survived, it'd be quite easy and everybody would be doing it. So I think you need a little bit of competition, a little bit of failure in there as well, providing we learn. Failure is good. I think as a culture and a nation, a bit like America, if you go to America, you'll find organizations failing and then the CEO will start a new company the following year and that'll fail, he'll start another one. Whereas in the UK, we tend to, oh, failure, I've not done very well. What should I do now? but we should learn from failure and celebrate it. If we fail fast and learn, that's a really good outcome. Let's learn, let's fail, but then come back stronger and do it differently the next time.
Hey, so let's say you're talking to a company like us, like Nine Technology, like a young, a focused company on one specific thing, like us on graphene electronics. Would learning from your mistakes be your number one advice you would give them, or is there something else that you would advise them also?
Gosh, there's lots of advice, and for me, the fail fast is really your question earlier about not trying to gold plate something and spend years and years doing that. So the fail fast is more about testing the market, testing the product, getting feedback. I think testing. I'm a strong believer. Your question earlier, innovation sounds very simple. It's like a linear model. We often talk around technology readiness level, TRL from 1 to 9. So TRL 1, 2, and 3 is your blue sky research or early stage research. TRL 7, 8, 9 is your product material out in the marketplace. And in the middle, we have what's called the valley of death, the gap between concept and reality. Um, I think it sounds simple. It sounds like you go through a linear process. But one of the experience I have, and it's one of your questions earlier, that innovation is a little bit like snakes and ladders. You come with a fantastic idea and you go up a ladder and you think you've got something that's ready, and suddenly you try and repeat it and it fails. So you go down a snake and you start again, sort of analogy. So for me, I think I'd encourage any business to fail fast, to learn, to try and not gold plate things and try and get a version 1 to get some feedback, whether that's customer feedback or market feedback. Concrete is a good example, as well as doing a lot of the research with our partners. A lot of our partners are also doing pours of concrete on paths, on cycleways, on roads, on simple things, because that's a good way of getting feedback to understand, and you can feed that back into your concept or idea. So I use a concept, I call it the living lab. As well as doing the science, we want to do some of that engineering in a real world environment so we can get feedback. So often that fails, but that failure can be learning that you can feed back and save you lots of time. So it's more of a mindset than trying to fail. I think it's more a case of that rapid innovation and doing things at pace and speed is what we're really trying to help our partners as do going forward.
That that sounds really helpful. Thank you for this advice. I also wanted to ask, how important would you think is sticking to your niche?
Sticking to your, sorry, apologies.
So niche, like to sticking to your area.
Oh, sorry, you're right. Okay. Um, So one of the challenges with some of our, and this is probably a challenge of graphene, you can very quickly go from your core area into many other areas. So again, I guess the question is twofold. One is I'm very much a supporter of what I call multidisciplinary teams. So you need to have teams with different experiences. I see from a lot of our startups, they're fantastic academics, but if you're a startup, you suddenly need to do finance, you suddenly need to do commercial, you need to do contracting. And I see some startups trying to do everything and they start to get very thin and struggle, whereas they're actually great scientists. And I think they would be better off, bringing in complementary people in their teams who can help them. I also see people who maybe start in an area that they're very familiar with, water, but then suddenly find themselves doing something to do with batteries. So again, I think yes, keep to your core area both in terms of skills and in terms of market, but don't dismiss the other areas. But an investor doesn't necessarily want to see someone addressing 20 markets. They want to see someone who's addressing one market very well, but maybe then there's an opportunity in the future to address these adjacent markets. So it's a difficult question to answer, but I think focus. Again, I was brought up in a sort of a philosophy of something called fix, focus, and grow. And what that really means is fix is about having a very good solid foundation, before you do things. That could be around investment, it could be around intellectual property, it could be around your team. Focus is then when you start to deliver something in a particular area. And then grow is once you've done that, you can really expand and you can go forward. You get some people who try and grow before they've fixed anything. They've got no funding, they've got no team, they've got no intellectual property. Yeah, so systematic thinking is probably the key learning in terms of that, as opposed to sticking to your own knowledge. You can bring people in, you can scale, but don't try and do too much too quickly, is probably the advice.
Okay, that was very inspiring of you. Thank you very much for answering our questions. And thank you in general for taking the time to have a conversation with us. It was very insightful.
No, thank you and good luck. And it's great to see, another example of companies that are starting to grow and to see the opportunity of not graphene, just graphene, but advanced materials and how we might commercialize those to make a difference in the future.
Yes, thank you so much for your time. We will definitely be keeping an eye on what's next for GEIC. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great talking to you both.